Hello and welcome to my presentation on the educational psychologist Lev Vygotsky. Lev Vygotsky was born in 1896 and died in 1934, and for such a small career he achieved a huge amount. He was from Russia and he's most known for his contributions to educational cognitive psychology. A branch of developmental psychology, cognitive development attempts to explain cognitions, for example, thought, language, attention, and information processing. Most of his work was not translated and not published until after his death. And however, according to Smaverovsky, 2007, he is often referred to as the Mozart of psychology, both for his ability to compose final drafts on the fly and for his early death. Smaverovsky also is of the opinion that for educators, the works of Vygotsky hold Bible status. Vygotsky has 6 books and has numerous articles published. Some of the most important ones are Thought and Language, as well as Mind and Society, the development of higher psychological processes, which we will touch on in this presentation, and The Psychology of Art, one of his first theses. Because his work was not translated until later on, America soon discovered Vygotsky's theories, and American psychologist Jerome Bruner subsequently decided to develop Vygotsky's work on the zone of proximal development with the scaffolding theory. And often, Vygotsky's theories are compared and contrasted to the work of another cognitive development psychologist, Jean Piaget. So, Vygotsky's theories. His theory is based on socioculturalism, that social and cultural interactions shape and help the development of our thinking. Thinking develops from the outside in. This contrasts to Piaget's thought that thinking develops from the inside out. So, firstly, we'll point on 3 main topics, which is culture, language, and the zone of proximal development. So, according to Oakley, 2004, what children learn about the world and the way this knowledge is learned is determined by the society and environment to which they belong in other words, culture. They create biases, internalize the culture they belong in, and this provides a framework to construct meanings. And also, they internalize thought patterns of their culture. Secondly, language is possible because of culture, according to Johnson, 2014. Vygotsky saw language as central to the learning process. Thinking develops on a social level, then children internalize this, so we must be careful what we say around children and adults. Vygotsky also developed 3 stages of speech development, the first being social external speech, the second egocentric speech, and the third inner speech. And thirdly, the zone of proximal development, one of the most important things about Vygotsky's theories. According to Vygotsky in Mind and Society, the zone of proximal development is the distance between the actual level of development, as determined by independent problem solving, and the level of potential development, where they can perform a task if a more knowledgeable other, or MKO, helps them. The MKO must test the student's prior knowledge. Perhaps this would be done through Bruner's KWL method: what the learner knows, what the learner wants to know, and what the learner wants to learn. Then, building on students' prior knowledge, the MKO must scaffold the learning. Scaffolding is providing a structure or support so students can complete a task above their independence level. However, it's important to point out that Vygotsky never used the scaffold term. However, Bruner developed this term based on theories. The zone of proximal development helps the cognitive development of elementary mental functions to higher mental functions, and this can be done through questioning. And here's a nice diagram explaining the independent level, the zone of proximal development, and the frustration level. It's also important to consider that the MKO is a facilitator, scaffolding the learning based on the learner's prior knowledge. They are not considered as banking educators, in which They know all the information, and this relates to Freire's theory on this, which he discusses in Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So, further developments and contributions of theorists. We've mentioned Bruner a few times. Oswald and von Glasper also further developed Vygotsky's theories. However, Bruner is the most significant one. Bruner was a cognitive and developmental psychologist. He's the most modern out of the cognitive revolution, and he sits beside Vygotsky, Piaget, and Dewey. He too believed, like Vygotsky, that a child is an active learner and a problem solver. And he also saw the importance of social interaction and wrote a lot on social constructivism. Vygotsky's theories were extended by Bruner to introduce the term scaffolding and by introducing the theory of the spiral curriculum. He also extended Vygotsky's belief of the environment and culture by proposing 3 levels of representation. However, it's also important to note one difference between Bruner and Vygotsky is that Bruner put more emphasis on scaffolding instructions, whereas Vygotsky put more emphasis on the MKO. So, Vygotsky is often contrasted to Jean Piaget. In Vygotsky's book, Thought and Language, Piaget is critically analysed. So some similarities between the two: they both have an interest in art, they work in the field of child cognitive development, and they view that children are active learners and not passive ones. And this contrasts many behavioural theorists, such as Ivan Pavlov, who viewed learning as a passive activity. So if we just go through 2 or 3 differences, the main difference is that Piaget viewed that children learn from internal, whereas Vygotsky children learn from the external environment. Piaget believed that thinking develops in stages, notably 4, that are successive and age-related. Students need to be ready to cognitively process learning, and this contrasts with Vygotsky's view that language and culture develops thinking, and that the zone of proximal development encourages constant learning, and children can learn anything from any age with the right structure. They don't need to be ready in a process. Secondly, according to Piaget, the egocentric speech is a sign of immaturity, which this contrasts with Vygotsky, who argues that thought and language, that direct thought is social. In Piaget's work, scaffolding or something similar is not seen. There is more emphasis on schemas, the organization of thought and behavior, whereas Vygotsky preaches about scaffolding or similar things. It's also important to note out that Piaget's theories were broadly tested. However, the theories of Vygotsky are not broadly tested. And in the contemporary world, Piaget's views and theories do not hold as much status as Vygotsky's theories. So, a critical analysis of Vygotsky and contemporary views, it's important to point out that not many teachers and learners read Vygotsky's primary source literature. They generally get this information from secondary source literature. So, according to Bates, 2023, Vygotsky's theory does not recognise that individuals can rise above social norms based on their ability to bring around personal understanding. And this would also tie in on Dabrowski's theory on gifted students. And Oakley, 2007, sum up a critical analysis of Vygotsky in 3 main concepts. Firstly, the theory doesn't specify the quality of help given by the MKO. Secondly, the individual intervention is time-consuming and costly. To fulfill Vygotsky's theory, can we do this in schools? And thirdly, peer tutoring is not successful for every learner. Its implications for art education, teaching and learning. So firstly, Vygotsky wrote on the psychology of art, which is touched on briefly in his book. Secondly, the social nature of teaching and learning is inherently important, especially in the learning environment. In relation to a socio-cultural theory, external environmental learning is important. So we might do this by having posters of art on the wall or an atelier wall. Irish culture can also infiltrate teaching and learning, for example, primary sources, Irish artists, and the history of art in Ireland, and also contemporary views. The zone of proximal development is imperative in the art curriculum. The more knowledgeable other may be a teacher or an artist brought in, or perhaps children learning from their peers. In each lesson, we model and demonstrate a task, and this scaffolds the learning for each student. We also provide mid-task evaluations and step-by-step learning. It's also important to note that Vygotsky was an advocate for abstract thought among neurodiverse students, not just concrete thought. And we can also facilitate elementary and higher mental functions while questioning, which contributes to the development of inner speech for the children. So here is an example of a unit of learning titled Nature's Deepest Textures, and I'm going to use this to contextualize Vygotsky's theories within my own teaching process. So briefly, the aim, with an emphasis on texture and tone, compose a woodland-inspired painting using acrylic paint and mixed media on canvas. And the strand is art. So in the first lesson, the students we can also include another theorist, Bloom's taxonomy, to structure the lesson plan. So in the first lesson, using Bloom's knowledge category, the students fill in what they already know about nature and the process and what they would like to know. Then we go on a field trip to collect objects and photos, and we stick this and annotate this in our sketchbook. Then, in the second lesson, we're comprehending and applying our learning from lesson 1 by creating tonal charts, which will help us create a tonal composition of a drawing or of a photo or an object. Thirdly, in the third lesson, we're exploring texture, creating texture grids, and then creating a textured version of our lesson 2 drawing, which will be in the student's zone of proximal development. Then we're creating a thumbnail composition, preparing the canvas, and in subsequent lessons 5 and 6, we're painting, and then we're going to use a reflection task, the L part of Bruner's theory, and then we're also going to create a mini exhibition. Here's the learning content, learning intentions, and success criteria, but what I'm most interested is expressing how I'm using Vygotsky's theory in my practice, and I can show this through the lesson plan. So the first activity we would do is a feel and describe object blindfold game at the start of the class, and this gets students up and out of their seat. It's a social activity. They're using language to describe objects, and they're progressing this to thought, and they're also learning from their peers. Secondly, I'm going to give a textured presentation and a presentation on Vincent van Gogh. This will help the students internalize learning, and through questioning, I can facilitate elementary mental functions to higher mental functions and abstract thinking. Then I'm going to give a demonstration on how to create the texture page. This relates to scaffolding and modeling the learning, which the students will then internalize. The students will do this student activity, and this is in their zone of proximal development. We'll also differentiate this activity. Then in part 7, I'm going to demonstrate on translating the tonal drawing into a textured drawing, and this would be in the zone of independence level. So the independence level would be creating the charcoal drawing. The zone of proximal development would be to turn this charcoal drawing into a textured piece. And then the students will do this, and at the end I'll give a group evaluation and reflection and ask questions that will boost their higher mental function as well as their language and thought.